Hey, folks. Thanks for stopping by Kaisers Kastle. I have a treat for you. It's a twofer today. I did one earlier on some mentoring and stuff. Right now, I have a very good gentleman, a hell fellow well met, and I mean that, Robert Kelke Weisthor. Uh, Very good man. If you look up his page, the link is in the description, kalkiweisthor.net. www.kelkiweisthor.net. Link is in the description, like I said. Uh, we're going to do pretty much free range. What he wants to discuss is what I want discussed because that's the important part. It's not about me. This is about him. And we will have a discussion. But with that being said, Robert, welcome to the Kaisers Kastle.
Well, it's good to be back. It's a good rainy day, so I guess it's a good day to be in the castle. So.
There you go. There you go. So, where do you want to jump off with today? You have any ideas?
Oh, maybe. I was thinking about. I've been a little bit reluctant to write lately, as anybody who normally follows my website and my blog has probably noticed. Because for one thing, you get into kind of if you stop writing and you get things bottled up, and then they want to come out all at once, and you step on yourself, so it becomes impossible to generate anything. But also, I'm having some issues in terms of framework, and it's really hard to find kind of a starting device to reference things from. And just before we got on a little while ago, I was looking at my internet feed, and I get this thing on the Chinese social credit system, which I find to kind of be an interesting takeoff point for several of the points I want to make, because I think I had posted on Facebook or some such godless place about really there's a full documentary on exactly what they're doing. It's pretty fascinating stuff, just from a tech point of view, from kind of a dystopian sci-fi point of view, what they're doing with people's social credit. It's interesting to me. What all these, I mean, I like tech. I've always liked tech. I was a big sci-fi fan when I was a kid, so I'm not a tech Luddite by any means. But it's coming apparent to me that there's all this sort of reaction against privacy breaches on things like Facebook, and it's about privacy and data sharing and all that. And I'm starting to understand when you start to understand what they're really doing, you find that the issue of privacy, in the sense that we normally think of privacy as almost a side effect of the data mining that they're doing. And the reason I mention this, to start off with this, is that it takes us back to what my central theme would be, is that we in this, I think in now that we're becoming more clear on what the 21st century, what the 21st century really is in opposition to the 20th. And I think it's taken us, close to the end of the second decade to really understand what's happened. Is that a lot of us who are resistant to the dominant paradigm and to what's going on and what's being done to and with us are trying to fight a battle with weapons from the previous century. And we're fighting according to the rules of previous century. We're, from a military point of view, which looks like the poor, peasants who were trying to fight with horses and swords against tanks, in the world wars. I mean, and I think we're being defeated on those grounds because that's the tools we're being given to work with. So, I realize that it's thrown out like that maybe makes no sense to a lot of people, so I can try to explain.
Oh no, it makes perfect sense. Look, fourth generation warfare, the millennials understand this.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
you and I are like trying to have to come up to speed, although, me still being active in certain things.
Right.
I do understand fourth gen warfare, and we're heading into fifth gen, but
right.
That's something that even the generals aren't looking at. You always fight the last war. That's a military axiom that's very correct. But your perspective on this about fighting last century's war and taking 20 years to rev up to those realities is something that's very prescient. And I would love for you to expound on it.
Well, just to be brief, I mean, we were talking a little bit before. I mean, I think that first, what was my breakthrough to what I see out of the kind of muck that we're fed by the disinformation, by the media system, and by history, so-called history, and all that. The myth of the 20th century, the false myth of the 20th century that we're taught. Breaking out of that mythology, because I knew we talked about this before, I knew when I was a child there was something wrong with that. It took me many, many years to figure out what it was. And that was important, because I was born in the 20th century, and obviously everything came out of that context. But it was important as developmentally for me. It was a way of breaking free. And I think that happens to a lot of people, because we all come out of that era. It wasn't that long away, 70 years ago. But on the other hand, you don't want to use that liberation that comes from that realization to refight the same battles, because honestly, those battles have already been either lost or no longer relevant to the situations we face. And I think that talking about moving in, for example, we talked about that with terms, people trying to refight World War II, try to come back. Oh, okay, we're going to be Nazis again. We're going to, that just doesn't work, because all those paradigms are not even relevant to where we are now. Right. Just like some of the racial paradigm, when you look at, for example, racial or cultural or not cultural, racial or genetic identitarianism coming out and people seizing those identities, we're reacting against the erosion of those identities by kind of over-asserting in a certain sort of way. We don't want to live in a world in which, who we are has been, okay, we identify with being part of a family, part of a kin, part of an ethnic group, a race, a species, and it goes on up. And these are all important parts of our identity. It's why, for example, Madison Avenue, you couldn't sell new dishwashers to Quakers. You couldn't, or I don't know. I'll probably confuse all these groups because it's not really the point.
No, not really. Mennonites, Quakers, Amish, it's all relevant.
But if you come from the point is, if you come from a traditional culture, you have certain things that you need to live your life, and you don't really need anything else. And so it's only by destroying people's identities. Edward Thorson, Stephen Flowers, in one of his old Runa radio podcasts talking about it was called Every Man a Black Man. There was nothing particularly racial about the podcast. It was the fact that what the culture that blacks had, and without being judgmental about what that may or may not have been when they were brought as slaves to America, without discussing who brought them or why. But the fact is that whatever culture they had was obliterated and destroyed. Even the languages were destroyed. And so when those people became members of society, again, without being judgmental about that process, somehow, by some means, they're suddenly thrown into being full-blown members of society by the end of the 19th century. But yet they don't have the cultural references. They're speaking a form of English that was taught to them by lower working class slavers who happen to be British, and that's the source of Black English. Their religion is Christianity as filtered through the worst of the whites that they were working with. So they're given this like the worst parts of our culture. The other reflection that comes to me is seeing what was done to Native Americans in the Southwest. Their culture destroyed. They're given the worst dregs of our culture. There's nothing worse to me than Navajo food, because it was like Mexican food with no spices. It was horrible. Anyway.
Right. No,
I'm really sidetracked.
No, not at all. I got it from the Hualapai in Arizona. Yeah. The Hualapai have no spice, and yet they get the tortillas. They do everything like you said. So I'm tracking, and I hope everybody else can too.
So anyway, so you get these destroyed, annihilated cultures, and what they get is the worst part of popular culture. And Thorson's point in that podcast is you could sell that black man anything because he didn't have any cultural sense of what he did and didn't need. And so what Madison Avenue endeavored to do early in the 20th century was, when you obliterate specific European cultures, you put people in that same pot. So part of modern capitalism, this is capitalism, not what came after, was to destroy cultural identity so everybody was a potential customer for everything. And that's part of what the breakdown of social groups is about. The reason they're trying to turn whites against blacks or men against women, someone who sees them no longer, it's one thing to see yourself as a person whose identity comes from various other identities. You are a member of a specific national group, a specific race, a specific gender, or I don't even say genders, you're a specific sex. Gender doesn't really apply to people, it applies to words. You are all those things, and you're also the member maybe of a trade, maybe you're part of a, some sort of caste, informal caste system with your occupation, you're a graduate of a particular school or university, anything, a religious affiliation. All these are parts of who you are. And most people don't walk around taking just one of those things and using it as their sole badge of identity. And so it's very different to have an identity that's compounded of different substructures, any of which you can refer to and use as a point of reference. I'm a white male or an Asian female who also is a Christian or a Buddhist, but here's my reaction to this. That's the opposite of what they're trying to do, this radical individualization that was structured by modern mass capitalism, is someone with no identity except the self. And this also goes to the breakdown of the family and all that stuff. And so if the person has no identity, they can be sold anything. And this is kind of, you can look at it as something that's foisted upon our culture by a disease or a particular outside group of people that's trying to destroy our culture. You can also look at it as something that happens through an operation of kind of a natural mechanism of the marketplace. And I think they're both correct, because who's doing it to us is not... It's not some guy out there trying to do it to us. It's a quote God unquote. It's a metahuman phenomenon. It's a force. It's Yahweh. It's the power behind Yahweh, and
it's a mechanization.
That's one of the effects. That's one of that's one of the processes that goes on. And so when I look at now what was occurring to me the other day, and obviously this happened after World War II, we have all the things that the traditionals kind of supposedly red-pilled groups react to, in terms of, like, for example, racial mixing, what they call race mixing, miscegenation in old terms, I mean, my position is that on something like that is an individual choice is an individual choice. The person can do whatever he wants. It's really none of my business. That's real privacy. The problem I have is when you have a group or an institution trying to force something on people, and force them against their natural bents, so that they are, in fact, so that a goal is accomplished, which is the goal of the outside force, which is the destruction of the white European culture that was dominant, which was their main opponent, right, in the modern world.
Yep, through propaganda.
So whereas, so I don't have it against it's not, an individual can make that choice anytime those wants. And anytime you have two cultural groups or racial groups or ethnic groups, there's going to be some melding on the fringes. And that's just a natural process. But when you try to force the nucleus together, you have a totally different situation. So anyway, you have this stuff all going on through the end of the 20th century. And, of course, the 21st century kind of began with a bang, literally, with 9/11. I mean, the first thing that was supposed to happen was Y2K, and it didn't happen. The planes didn't fall out of the sky. So everybody said, okay, everything goes on as normal. And then a year and a half later, bang, And I don't even want to get into what really happened there, because that's the can of worms that we'll never fall out of this afternoon.
You're right.
But so obviously somebody did something intentionally for something. The overall effect, which we know why it was done, was that suddenly the government was able to start seizing powers that people would have, it made people, it was done structured very well to make people not resist erosion of traditional civil liberties and personal privacy issues and things like that. And it was brought, I'm listening to on Audible this book, which is actually it's written it's written by a Harvard professor, so I'm pretty sure it's a leftist orientation. But still, a lot of these things, even I can read these scholarly things, especially when they're historical, and disagree with everything about the premise, but still get a lot about the analysis and certainly the research that's being presented. Most of these people don't alter the facts any more than they have to fit their theses, to fit them into their modern sociological, Frankfurt School later Frankfurt School frameworks. But anyway, talking about surveillance capitalism, and it's kind of interesting because she actually does a very good analysis of what's being done with the kind of data overflow that was mined by Google and these companies. And it's interesting when you look at this stuff. Without getting into that too deeply, I could probably find you the name of that book, because I'm not really trying to sell the book, 'cause I'm still listening to it. The other thing that was happening about the same time as 9/11, what really did happen in 2000 from a technological point of view, which is, but certainly a sociological point of view, is the first wave of failures of the early dotcom bubble that had popped out of Silicon Valley. And you have all these early dot-com startups. Google was out there. Certainly Apple had been out there for quite a while. Apple's actually a different story than any of these other companies. Amazon was out there. So suddenly all of these companies, if you look at the dot-com bubble, it's pretty fascinating, because you have all these new technology companies that are being basically worshipped and incredibly overvalued in terms of stock value, which is what caused this. And they were all running losses, but yet people keep pouring more and more money in, and it was justified in the long run, because they were coming out with a product that people correctly saw was going to be earth-shaking. I wish I had Apple stock, or even Facebook or Google stock, even though I feel evil, from that period. I'd be wealthy, obviously more than wealthy.
Of course.
But anyway, this stuff all crashes out in 2000. Maybe that was the real Y2K. Anyway, I'd have trouble arguing that. But so suddenly meanwhile, and it's interesting if you try to point to individuals, but suddenly, for example, Google is started by these two guys, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, I think, and who are these Stanford guys. And I think, honestly, if you look at the history of everything, I have no reason to think it was anything other than kind of an effort to say, look what we can do. We can devise a search engine that really individualizes search results and gives better results, gives people what they want. And the early years of Google were really about giving the quote customer, unquote. You're no longer the customer at Google, by the way. But giving them these individualized results. And then suddenly, at the end of the dot-com bubble, all these companies are struggling for survival. And about this time, modern data mining, a use for this data that's being mined, is found. And it's interesting that if I try to pin this to one individual, and I'm not sure about this, but looking at these names, the person who actually strikes me as being fairly instrumental is this person. I think her name is Susan Sandberg or something like that.
Yeah.
Who was she was a Google exec who moved over to Facebook about the time both of them started monetizing. Who was instrumental, I understand, in the developing of Google AdSense and these things, where they were suddenly for the first time targeting advertising based on your web searches, and not only your web searches, but the little trackers that would follow you to other parts of your web engine and would tell them more about you than you knew that they had been told, which still are out there in massive force these days. But anyway, her transition seems to somehow have something to do with it. But it doesn't matter who, because suddenly at this point, this came in, and these forces that seemed fairly benign before that are suddenly. But it was far later than that day that most people I know were still asking themselves, Google Mail is free. It's a free service being provided to us. And Facebook is free. It doesn't cost us anything, and we can find our high school friends without, and you'd think, well, how do they make any money on this? But people just let it by because it was still fun to do these things. I think these days people are more sophisticated about that sort of thing and realize their data is being mined. But then follow me to the next step here. So if you tell me as a normal person who goes on Google and does his searches and goes on Facebook and, posts his pictures and, someone who's a fairly normal use of these two sites. And you say, what's being done? What's paying for this? You say these searches are going into all your data. Google is looking at your emails. Facebook is looking at your posts and also your emails, and they're sharing information. They're tracking you to Amazon, which is also tracking you separately. They're going to every page you purchase anything or even think about purchasing anything. They're looking at articles you go to read, and they're building a profile of you. What is the point of this profile of you? And now this is where people start getting justifiably, I think, paranoid and saying my privacy is being invaded. I don't want someone turning on my webcam to see me when I get out of the shower. I, I don't, which is not what they obviously, or hopefully they're not wanting to do. I don't think they're just massive perverts out there, although they're probably in the system. I mean, I don't want somebody seeing my bank account because it's none of their business. And there's most of this, it's just kind of an almost anachronistic sense of privacy that comes from the values of another age. And I know that people will say, wait a minute, I have a right to that privacy. And you think, I won't even discuss that legally where the right to privacy comes from. Anyway, but then I think most people at some point will say, okay, what are they doing with this information? It's kind of like, in the old days, we used to think maybe somebody is listening to our phone calls because we'd finally figured out that, of course, they could if they wanted to. But who has time to listen to all these phone calls? Right? Because obviously nobody has time to listen to every phone call. Now we're in an age where there are things that can listen to every phone calls. AI can listen to every phone call. They can sort it. They can parse it. They can distill the information. But so I think our personal reaction to having our rights, our data and privacy rights violated is the kind of thing, okay, there's some guy out there, here's your subjective unconscious reaction, I think. There's some guy out there who knows what I had for breakfast, who knows what kind of sex I had. They know what kind of cereal I eat, and they know how much money's in the bank. They know I'm overdrawn on a credit card. They know I have certain medical issues I'd rather not talk about in public that are embarrassing. They know that, my uncle turned gay and had sex with a sheep. They know all this stuff that I don't want known. There's some guy who knows this from researching my internet stuff. And I don't want to meet this guy on the street because it would be embarrassing. That's what it feels like subjectively to be this paranoid person. I don't want this person following me around and making public comments about me. Go ahead.
It's not subjective. I mean,
yeah,
this is no such agency, and
right.
This is what happened. It was metadata was sold that we're just scooping this stuff up. It's like a fire hose going into a hose at your house, and we have to scoop it up that way. No, they can aim that lawn hose at that metadata and scoop everything up. And then the interesting thing that nobody is talking about right now, you brought something up that's very prescient. And this is something I actually know about. People are getting upset because all of a sudden there's microphones in your heater, your little control box.
Yeah.
People are upset now because there's microphones and video from your computer and your television. So if you're on cable, guess what? They're feeding everything to that same no such agency. So it's a bunch of ridiculousness. And I know you have probably had the same experience, although you monitor your stuff. I don't care about my stuff because I'm just old and I don't care.
Yeah.
But
I'm the same way to some extent.
Okay, we get it, brother. But the real deal that nobody wants to talk about is that you can go order something, and then what's in your Facebook, the data mining stream on the right-hand side, the ads of what you went to or where you're going to, especially Google, the big problem nobody's talking about, they now have bought the old Stasi building, and they have the old Stasi bitch who is in charge of this collection, who is now in charge of European things. So do you not think, remember we used former quote-unquote Nazis for our space program. Also, they've done it for our CIA because we could not get successfully infiltrated into the old false paradigm of the Soviet complex. And with that, I want to see you run with this because, brother, I know you can.
Well, I don't know about the Soviet. The historical aspect is also interesting. You're right; they were using it's just kind of that goes back to, for example, the American rocket program. There are analogies going way back into the 20th century too. I guess the problem with this data mining that you're talking about, not only, okay, phase one is this invasion of privacy that you have, right? This perceived invasion. And you can get over that to a certain extent because phase two, you kind of relax because at some point, part of me says, okay, when I realize it's not particularly a guy looking at my information, it's not some guy listening on my phone, right? It's this other automatic spotlight, searchlight theory of targeting that's going on. They're looking for certain items. If that's being used to try to sell me things, and in fact, what they are doing is they're trying to use it to sell me things that I'm more likely to buy. The real business here, people say that, for example, with regard to Facebook and Google, if it's free, you're the product. And the fact is, you're not the product. And this is not my original thought. I was listening to this and reading it, and I agree with it. You're not the product. What you are is the source of a raw material that is being used for basically prognostication. All this stuff is being mined so they can predict what you're going to do. And specifically in the original, the fact that the original more benign uses, they were selling it to advertisers to try to sell you targeted ads like you're talking about.
Exactly.
So I don't mind it that somebody is targeting some, non-human intelligence, which is purely commercial for the most part, even in its early application, although it doesn't have a nature of being an AI. If it's being used to target things that I'm more likely to be interested in and buy, why does that bother me? It's not giving me tampon ads. It's not giving me ads for flower bulbs. It's not giving me ads for Chinese dictionaries. So that's fine. I would, if you're going to give me ads that are more interesting to me. That doesn't bother me, of course. So there's that phase. And then people kind of relax and they say, okay, if they're going to take all my personal data and use it for that purpose, why should I object? And it sounds like you have a co-host there with you, but oh, that's all right. But so the Chinese data mining thing is what I was. It's a good illustration of what can happen when this data that's out there gets used for the wrong reasons. And there's a great documentary I saw on this. I don't even watch the little thing I just posted on Facebook, but it's amazing. There's interviews with, say, dissident journalists in China, whatever a dissident journalist in China amounts to. Mostly they were people with probably mainstream Western values, which is interesting, who are suddenly, not only can they not take a bus or a plane, they can't get into certain stores because their biometrics are so much more advanced than ours. Facial recognition, massive facial recognition at every intersection, scanning people. I mean, it's something out of the worst nightmares of dystopian fiction. And this is supposed to be totally in place in China by 2020. They interview in the documentary, I saw a young couple who are doing everything they can to be right with the Chinese, quote, communist, unquote, party. They're not very communist, if you ask me. They're just totalitarian in a certain sense, in a very Chinese sense. Who suddenly are being given, if these people want an apartment, not only do they get a reduced price based on their social score, but they don't have to put down a deposit.
Exactly.
These things, if you're on the bottom end of the social score, you're not allowed to apply. Now, this is the fear that everybody has from exactly this kind of thing. This is the Great Western Fear. And people, I think, are correct that we would have a resistance to it because of our historical sense of personal rights. It is true, constitutional rights and everything else. That's one reason why it's not as easy to implement this kind of system. For us, for the Chinese who never had that same expectation of privacy, look at, the WeChat that they use on their Chinese internet all the time that, is invasive in a way that, we would never tolerate. Even you think Facebook is bad? Look at this thing. Look what it does. You can't. It targets it. Your GPS doesn't turn off when you turn off the app. They know where you are all the time. It's amazing. Or you can't buy any. Cash is almost gone extinct in some of these. I understand if you go even to the Shenzhen now. what is that, a 2 hour boat ride from Hong Kong. It's almost impossible to find a place to buy your lunch with cash. It's all through their equivalent of Apple or Google Pay.
Yep.
And then it's all tracked.
Well,
and the government is right in on it, in a sense.
There's something that you said that's very prescient. Thanks for Jeffro and for Ivy stopping by. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Keep going.
Well, I mean, so there's this totalitarian tracking system there that they're able to use that's being resisted here. So it gives people a good thing to fear. This is you say, why shouldn't I allow them to have my data? That's the reason. On the other hand, what is occurring to me is that, it's the same sort of people who fight back against any kind of this. It's kind of like this is a inevitable force that's moving forward at this point. I don't see us stopping short of the annihilation of modern technological society and a reversion to some earlier era, which almost never seems to happen. I don't see it stopping. I see that what we need is probably not to react against it. I mean, you can take yourself off the internet to some extent. You can, I certainly do use.
It's the work within it. It's the work within it.
Right, exactly. By opting out, you basically just make yourself powerless. Because my other major point is, and it keeps occurring to me, and this is another thing from the kind of sci-fi I like. Read William Gibson stuff. At some point, all these future dystopians, and it's even in mainstream stuff now because it's so obvious, the movies, is that nationalist governments are kind of a fading phenomenon. And we see these massive corporate powers taking, the real battles being now. It's fascinating to me what's going on with this warfare between companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google in particular. And then, of course, you have the Chinese companies. Then you have Apple, and Apple is fascinating to me because they're kind of like, in a sense, because they don't do the data mining stuff, they're kind of like the last vestige of old style capitalism. They're kind of the conservative entity in this fight. And I just saw Apple being attacked for liberal politics, which they are on the surface, but it's kind of ironic to me that their actual status is being the real conservative who is basically just trying to sell people expensive stuff and trying to sell their souls, as Google is.
And it's Apple, honestly, until they went to China and did their Red Dragon or whatever it was called, Apple was the holdout.
Right.
And with Foxconn, all that stuff that went on in the past few years under the last last president. Right. So now if we think about this logically, there is a rebirth of nationalism. And you're seeing it in Italy, you're seeing it down in Brazil, you're seeing it in the USA, which is leading the way, and also with Brexit in England. And yet, what do you see the MSM doing? Totally undermining it. And they're trying their best, but guess what? The MSN has lost. Here's something you mentioned about Huawei or Huawei or whatever you want to call that thing.
Right.
When I was in Afghanistan a couple months back, I had to get a pod to be able to broadcast or talk to my wife on Skype or the internet because they have unstable internet. Well, guess what? Everything I said to my wife, talked with her about, and here's the weird part. You think that's just Chinese collection. Remember, they arrested that female, the Chinese female in Canada. Yeah.
Right.
And the more interesting part to me is that the government, under the last presidential dictum, I have 4 separate pages of where they had access to all my information. I'm talking my military, my federal history, everything, even as a contractor with 2 agencies. That's why there's 4 of them. They had access to it unfettered, and this is why security clearances have become irrelevant and I mean this in a real sense, is because they had access to it for 2 years. They have everybody from World War II all the way to present day until
Mm-hmm.
that last presidency ended. And let me
Mm-hmm.
tell you, as a Fed, you had to change your password every 3 months maximum,
Mm-hmm. All right.
military or federal, or state, even state. And yet they were able to even get into my National Guard records.
Oh, they don't. Let me. There's a sidetrack on that too. I was just thinking about this in the shower, as a matter of fact, and there's some information nobody needs. But the, um, people want to fight back against their personal information being taken by the government, and that's a healthy reaction from a personal point of view. But there's a real analogy to the whole discussion of guns here in the Second Amendment. If you don't mind me, it's a little diversion here. You know, if you have this argument over what they call gun control, which is gun confiscation or whatever, going on in America between, and of course, the quote conservative unquote rights side is arguing the Second Amendment, which of course they will, because it is the basic legal framework that protects guns for individuals in America, and which is extremely the problem. The second, somebody with some legal background, like the Second Amendment, is extremely problematic because, to me, it's a document. I don't want to. We could talk about the Second Amendment for hours, but it's a document that was written as a compromise and very specifically. And gun rights are going to say I'm wrong on this, but to me, very specifically to allow people to organize in state or smaller groups to resist the power of the federal government. That's exactly why it's in there. And it's left vague so that it would pass from the Federalists
Yes,
who
it
were opposing
was.
this point of
Yep.
view.
And the
And
anti-federalist.
yeah, I mean, but the fact is it's there. But, it's basically, my bottom line here is that the protection of guns in the Constitution basically is for protecting us, the people, or us, the people organized into states or militias, against the federal government. That's why it's there. I mean, that's exactly. It's not there to. And unfortunately, if you look at the reality of the modern world, if you're arming yourself for the reason of protecting yourself against the government or fighting the government, you're probably in a very precarious position. And for not
Exactly. You
only, I mean,
become
not only
a
legally, but
threat.
for one thing, you're outgunned. You're extremely outgunned. I mean, in the late 18th century, you didn't have the incredible disparity of weaponry between what the military had. I mean, look what you got. Look what you have. You have modern warfare that's almost like a video game.
Well,
And you can't fight that with pistols.
well, they've been able to in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not going to get
Yeah,
into the
yeah, yeah,
nuances
yeah,
of
yeah,
it,
yeah. Right. You can.
my general
Yeah.
point is that guns are irrelevant at this point. Here's the thing, and I want to ask you this question. It's very serious.
Uh-huh.
I remember back in the 80s, I figured, and the 90s, they'd come after the
Mm-hmm.
guns and then go after the First Amendment. They've
Mm-hmm.
done just the opposite. They're going after the
Mm-hmm.
First Amendment
Right.
first so the Second Amendment cannot speak. And I'd
Right.
love to hear your
Exactly.
thoughts on that, brother.
Well, yeah, and but just to end to the other point, the real reason that I think it's important to have guns is basically to protect yourself against the people who don't follow the law who do have guns. Against criminals, against gangs of invaders. That they're very potent
Right.
against in our society, and that's the reason that it's good to have them. If you're someone who does want to respect a structured society and protect your property, your family, and there's an analogy in there to the data thing. With regard to your question about, yeah, I mean. And again, freedom of speech is another, all these constitutional rights are, to a certain extent, antiquated concepts in the modern age. And I'm not saying they're not valid. I'm saying that they need to look at it in light of new factual situations. I mean, free speech is now being controlled. They've gotten much better. They're not trying to ban books so much, although they're doing that too. Is they're trying, it's a kind of soft totalitarianism. They want to get inside your head and make you control yourself. It's not like it's not like there are,
Exactly.
in any totality, look at the Russians. Look at the Russians. Anybody I know who actually knows Russians who survived, probably the worst, most horrible, outside of Pol Pot or something, which we know less about. But if you look at the Russians who survived everything that was done to Russia in the 20th century, up till at least the late communist age, so the first 80 years of the 20th century, but these people were all oppressed by externally oppressive governments. But all these people, to some extent, would get together in a little room and say, "Yeah, the government sucks. They're going to kill us. I wish we could escape, but we can't." But they had that, and they couldn't really take that away from people to some extent. And what they've done, and so, but you were always able. That's why Russians are so cynical, I think, for the most part to this day. Because there's a kind of like, okay, I'm going to smile and obey your rules, but I'm always resistant on the inside. That's one thing I think I kind of admire about some of those Russian and Slavic attitudes. Sometimes.
Exactly, and they don't even talk about dog walking time. There was a time,
right,
before the collapse of the Soviet Union,
right.
They called it dog walking time, and it was where people took their dogs for a walk, and it was during the mainstream media news. The difference was we developed a different type of media on YouTube, on Facebook, on all these different social platforms, and it gave us Donald Trump. I'm not saying he's the end-all, be-all. I'm not buying into all that. That's not what I'm coming from. But my thought process is at least people had a fucking voice, and now they're taking that voice from you. When I saw that they listed the Declaration of Independence as hate speech...
Right.
We have an issue here, America.
Right. Which, of course, part of that is an illustration of these AI bot flags grabbing stuff that turns out to actually be embarrassing for them later. It's not going to embarrass the bot. It's embarrassing, for example, for Facebook. And so it gets a great hammer for patriotic Americans and the right to beat them about having their free speech oppressed, to find the Constitution banned. It's one of those oops moments because they're not being so subtle when they do that. A lot of people who would agree, who can easily be conned on most of their other missives, they're going to see that and they say, "Wait a minute, that's not right." So that's an oops moment for them, certainly. But I mean, the difference is that people now, you're taught to, it's like with the whole white self-hatred thing I see going on. You're just being taught to defeat your own, look at Eastern Europe and then look at Western Europe. The Eastern Europeans and the Russians have been, it's like people who survived the plague. The people there are survivors of that kind of governmental head game crap, and they have some resistance to it. That's why you have Viktor Orban. That's why you have these people in Central Europe who are, whether you agree with them, whether they're right or wrong, these people don't want to be eaten by Russia or the EU. They just know none of that shit is for their own good, no matter what anybody tells them. But then you have, you have Iceland and you have Britain. Iceland is a good example because they're so naive and so new, and they'll believe anything, And here's an interesting side note. I just saw the Faroe Islands had banned tourism for the next year. That was one smart move I've seen any of these people do. But you say that because we as Western Europeans, the Nords, the Swedes, the Scandinavians, all those people had no resistance to this. And of course, the Germans got a nice dose of how that works. Anyway, to get back to the point was
exactly right. The Germans with Angela Merkel, and everybody forgets. I did it on my other channel. I think I linked you to it one time. If not, I will correct that. But I did a 3-part dissertation on how Angela Merkel is from the Mielke and also the Honecker line. And she was not just FDJ, she was also Stasi. And I know you understand this. And is this not the Stasi's wet dream that we're living in right now? And that's that would be a question for you, because I don't think I've ever asked that of you.
Well, it's an evolution, of what they wanted to do, and they couldn't pull it off. They didn't have the resources to pull it off. You combine that kind of infrastructure, that kind of desire, and that kind of intent with Western money capitalism, give them the Western banking power and finance that stuff. And suddenly it works with with Madison Avenue propaganda that's way beyond anything Goebbels ever thought of. And the propaganda that's being inflicted on us now, the thing about the data mining stuff, they're not only using this for advertising. That was level one. That's okay. I can pardon targeted ads. It's a little creepy, but at least it's interesting. But then you're talking about them influencing elections, and it's interesting how all the propaganda about influence on elections has been. It's been the victim crying out as he beats himself. They're claiming that the Russians hacked the elections and put Donald Trump in. That's absolutely ridiculous.
Exactly, and they're bringing up Cold War memes, and yet
right.
You have all these moronic, not the good millennials or the Gen Zs or even the Gen Xers believing it, because most of the boomers, unfortunately, are dead. And trust me, I lost my mom. So it's not like I'm talking out of school and shitting on boomers. That was my last show where
I'm at the back edge. I'm at the back edge of that myself, technically. So
same here.
Anyway,
but
right.
Gen X, man. But the thing is that really gripes my ass is that we were the bridge of duck and cover and the Soviets.
Right.
And we stood the wall still, and we watched it collapse, and we believed, honestly, winds of change from scorpions. You guys doubt me? Watch that video, you'll cry. You're seeing the same thing.
I remember that. I wanted to go to Germany. Yeah, when it was coming down.
Well, I wanted to, except I was in the Gulf War.
The
funniest shit.
You were busy.
Yeah. I was busy plying my trade. But the funniest thing is these people do not realize it's no longer a Soviet paradigm. It's something. Here's something. I told you about the circular, not the long left and right paradigm, but how it meets in the middle. We talked about this before the show. If you want to cover it, you can. If you don't, that's fine. I'm going to shut my mouth because this is about you, not about me.
Well, I mean, the point being that this datum, when you talk about the revival of nationalism, what we're seeing is a breakdown of the multinational. We're seeing a reaction against things like the EU. And especially the EU, I think, and the EU being nothing other than the modern version of the Soviet Union, trying to force the same thing upon Western Europe, and except slightly different people in power, but really just different aspects of the same people, and it's not really working that well. And so what you see when it breaks into pieces are kind of resurgent ethnic nationalism. I don't think that. I mean, if society were to totally break down, I think we'd break down further than that. It's hard for me to see the revival of the 20th century nation state as where we're going. I think that this. Now, here's my next point. I'm kind of trying to get to, and I keep sidetracking myself. Is that people look at these battles between these major corporations, and you say, what's interesting now? I mean, you have, for example, in politics, to me, is Democrat versus Republican, right versus left politics. To me, is totally uninteresting at this point. I don't care if you call yourself leftist. If you call yourself left or right in one of those orthodox opinions, you probably have nothing interesting to say to me. Because look at these stupid hearings that are going on TV. People hang out. Are people really watching this Michael Cohen stuff and thinking that's any kind of real thing? I mean, that's just. I mean, something's happening there, but it's a joke. It's a total joke. And so I think that the people see the real movement is going on. If you look at what these corporations are doing, the kind of subtle mental control that can only be done with this kind of AI technology, where they're manipulating. In other words, when they're targeting you for an ad, it's not just giving you an ad that you're more likely to buy. They're also calculating the time at which and the place in which you see that ad, in which you are most likely to be vulnerable to it. And when you look at that kind of framing, then you see how it can be used in a much larger than commercial sense to shape every aspect of your behavior. China is an indication of what can be happened if that's being handled by the wrong people. It has to be addressed differently in America because we have a different kind of psychological adherence. We don't like overt totalitarianism so much. We want to do it to ourselves, which is what's been done with all this political correctness mind shaping of this century. But when you have this thing that happened at the beginning of the 20th century with suddenly there's 9/11 and a political crackdown, and suddenly there's this invasive surveillance technology, which seems to come from a total different direction. And then you start to do the historical research and you realize Google was became very heavily involved with the CIA and the NSA at this point, right? And there's a lot of interaction going, the voluntary sharing of information. Then you see where we're going with this so my point is that the nation state, people are afraid of surveillance because they think the government is listening to them. To some extent, that's true. But you can kind of back away and say, okay, well, the thing is, what Facebook may be doing to me or Google or Amazon is bad, but they're not going to come in here with bombs and guns and kill me and my family, which the government can do or haul us all off to jail, right? And what I'm starting to see when you see this Chinese thing, but also look at the Huawei thing. I want to talk about that. The arrest of this woman who's the CFO of Huawei, who's the daughter of the dynasty, basically, that runs Huawei in China. You start to see that the corporations and the people behind the corporations and the other than people behind the corporations, which is the metahumans, which is a kind of intelligence which is using the AI in combination with human intelligence. So it's more than human. And also reflecting these gods that we talk about. That's who's taking control. It's not people. And for example, so China can do this by integrating their government into the system. The government is listening, but they're listening through something which is actually controlling them. The government itself is, to some extent, under control of these other entities, which aren't commercial entities, which are something they're like the new gods I was talking about of this new century. And if you want to see it, are you there? Hold on a second here. Just a minute. Can you hear me now? I may have just lost.
Oh, no,
Can you hear me now?
Didn't lose me. We're still here. You've been going on.
I thought I lost an ear device suddenly. Are you there? Hello? Okay. That's interesting.
Here. Of course I'm here.
Okay.
Brother.
I've lost my sound for a minute. Okay, we're on now. Good. Anyway, look at this Huawei thing for a second. Now, Huawei is this Chinese corporation which came out of this sort of, this boom started in China probably in the last, I think it started somewhere around 1980 after they loosened up and these companies came into their own in 1990. They're actually, I don't want to go into the history of these Chinese companies because it's interesting in and of itself. But Huawei basically being a big tech company that their main thing until the last few years has been to put together telephone router systems, right? They buy the telephone equipment that the phone companies use. And they're used all over the world for this. They're the largest in the world at these telephone router systems. And now they came under suspicion or came under adversity sometime probably during the Obama administration, I think it was. Yes, I think it was like 2012, 2013 was the first wave because people thought they were putting spyware in these things that was reporting back to the Chinese government. And so they were banned. They've been, for example, they're the biggest telecommunications equipment company in the world, and they're banned from the build out of the 5G network in America. And whereas the rest of the world, they're putting it in. And they've also come out with, it's kind of interesting to me because they've come out with some of the more interesting, they now make laptops, they now make phones. They've always made them in China, but they're beginning to get big play here in the American market. There was supposed to be a big Huawei device promotional campaign through AT&T sometime in the last 2 or 3 years. It got canceled at government recommendation with government coercion in America. So Huawei has been singled out as this evil foreign corporation spying for the Chinese government, and they are, whether it's really Huawei is, then look at Lenovo, for example. There's another Chinese company everybody thinks is perfectly cool that's not making the ThinkPad, right, and all these computers that people are using for their business work.
Well,
You know,
you're exactly
is it a shell
correct.
game?
Yeah, it
Go ahead.
is a shell game, and
Um,
I'm gonna bring it to light. Look, Lenovo and Huawei. Here's what
mhm.
happened. Uh, they were both Chinese companies, and now we've given the keys to the kingdom in Apple. Remember in '84 the Apple commercial? I wish I could
Mhm.
play it. I wish I had those skills.
Which one, the totalitarian of the
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
1984 one? Yeah,
yeah. It was in
yeah,
1984. It was the
yeah. It was
year of
beautiful.
1984. It was a beautiful
Right,
commercial if you look at it.
right.
But the thing is with Huawei and
Mhm.
Lenovo, they now are able to sync it.
Mhm.
And we'll say, well, China's our best friend. They still are
Right.
in the democratic mind. But Russia, who has become, I'm going to be very frank on this.
Mhm.
What will save the West, just like during Vlad Dracul's time, will probably be
Yep.
the East. And I mean that.
Mhm.
And if you could
Yeah.
expand on that, but that's something that just blows me away that we've allowed this shit to happen.
Mhm. Yeah. It's just to finish up on the Huawei thing. My point being that the arrest of this woman, this Huawei executive, and that she's now, I think, they're actually doing the extradition process to try to bring her to America and try her. I'm not saying they didn't do some spying. You know, they've got this Chinese thing. They don't think of trademarks in the same way we do. I mean, it just sounds like an apologetic to them way to do it. They're stealing our patents and things, but that really is something that they didn't have as part of their traditional business culture that we're trying to force them to accommodate because they're having to deal with us. And I mean, but what you're seeing there is a good example of commercial powers using governmental power to have war with each other. This is a war of American corporations against Chinese corporations being fought with the government as, as a mercenary force, basically. When you talked about criminal prosecution of people for doing corporate business in America. And
Corporations have made the government nation state. The worst thing that ever happened
mhm,
was about over 100 years ago when you didn't have national state armies.
mhm.
Pre 18, whatever it was, 17, whatever it was.
Right,
It was
right.
during the Napoleonic era.
Well,
At
we still
the
during the American Civil War, you still had certainly, all these regional armies and people dressed as African tribal
exactly,
fighters and things. Right.
exactly. But the thing was, they were mercenaries. In
Hmm.
mercenary conflicts, there's only several, and it was during the 20th century because they were being worked against by the likes like William Walker.
Hmm.
He's one of my heroes, by the way. William
Hmm.
Walker,
Hmm.
filibuster. Uh,
Okay.
I still have not been able to be a president of Nicaragua or some other nation state, but that was my
Right.
goal
Right.
after reading his book,
Right.
his
Right.
biography. But I'm making jokes. But the
It could
reality
be the next
is,
Aaron Burr.
yeah,
Anyway.
well, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't want to be an Aaron Burr, not at all. But the fact remain, you had Lord or not Lord Commodore Vanderbilt go
Mhm.
against him and pulled the full weight of the U.S. government against William Walker.
Mhm.
And
Right.
nobody wants to talk about the reality that those people in Nicaragua had a better lifestyle at that time.
Right. Yeah. 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 In terms of the East versus the West, I mean, I think you're. That's a very interesting. I guess that's a subset of a kind of problem that we tend to think. One of the things that the liberals or the universal liberals will accuse um, Western Europeans as being kind of an exceptionalist, that think that their culture is the most important in the world, and of course, they say it's really not. And I think actually that's a valid point to some extent, because we tend to think of that we're the only thing happening in the world. And so we see our enemies as world enemies, whereas they're only just a part of our own culture. And we forget that there's stuff going in. What I'm talking about kind of a reverse version of what's normally done with this concept, because there are actually larger. The West is probably eating itself, but what's more interesting is what's waiting on the outside to come in when we become so weak that we can't do anything with ourselves. Look at, for example, the Chinese military compared to what's going on with, I mean, the military, not the military itself so much, but the militarization of the society
Well,
as compared to what's going on here.
we become the snake eating its own tail, except there's a
Yeah.
problem on the West. We have allowed it to separate into two heads in America. And
Right.
those two heads still feed that same snake body.
Right.
And that's something I've pushed hard on this, is because you don't get to do that to Americans. And why I disagree with, this is what I like to call her, accidentally orgasmic cortex. And then you look all the way over on the right, when you're looking at what's going on this week with the people who are, and our president even went over there to that right side. It's a false right paradigm. We know where it ends up as a circular thing. But when you see that happening, that's what you're being fed.
Right.
The more parties, the better. And that's, parties are bullshit. You and I both, I think, agree similarly on this, but maybe not. Expand on that.
Parties? Well, I mean, they're all running on an anachronistic paradigm at this point, or various forms of anachronistic. They're all being controlled first by, I mean, when you look at the extreme advocates for the right and left are both advocating the rights of the very same group of people, that becomes a problem. So, and the centrists have no position at all. And if you're not if you're trying to come from outside of that dialogue, you don't have a voice, because suddenly you're using nothing but hate speech to express your views. So
corporatocracy.
Yeah, I mean, but if you don't see that, the problem is it's becoming very hard to force people. It's very hard to force people out of their paradigm when you're not allowed to use words to do it. And when this is very Orwellian, the words themselves are controlled in such a way that you literally cannot say what needs to be said, because you're not allowed to form the words, even in your own mind, even in your own writing, even in your own speech. So you have to kind of go at it sideways. It's kind of hard to you can't really teach anybody. A lot of the learning of this stuff, and this goes back to older discussions, it took me like 20 years or more of battering my head against certain concepts that just didn't feel right, to try to have some sort of breakthrough to see what was really going on. And that's kind of an individual process. You can't teach anyone to do that, because it's nonverbal. It's more, it uses higher mental facilities and other facilities. But, you try to sort of give people clues when you can. You kind of somehow use little nudges and things to get people to see things like what they call glitches in the matrix, just running loops in the story so that you can see it's a story and not the real story of life itself. And when you're not allowed to use these words, which are literally triggers, not so-called trigger words, but it really can be used to nudge people, then what do you do?
Yep.
It becomes much harder. That's where we are, I think. But I think, if you go out and buy into any organized group's agenda right now, the further you get from the mainstream, the more likely it is that everybody you're talking to is working for the mainstream. They're like, if somebody joins a neo-Nazi group, what percentage in there is working for the government?
It's usually pretty heavy. I mean,
Right.
I did that research. You and I talked about that offline, but I'll never punch right, the proverbial right. I also know where the left comes. And honestly, there is a certain point where people are saying I'm socialist, No
Yeah.
matter what side it is, they're still going to the left. And
Hmm.
they're just it's a perfect storm that they've created. And when I say
Right.
they, everybody on my page, I guarantee, understands that it is they created. And it's not the normal everyday they you may know. Those people can be perfectly
Hmm.
fine.
Right.
But
Right.
but
Right.
then we encapsulate them and we degenerate them. And you look at the people that research, oh, this is hate. Oh, well, okay. I believe that my wife and I are the only two people with other male and female combinations that can create life, although science has made it possible through turkey basters or whatever to
Yeah.
make
Yeah. Right.
lesbians have life. But I
Right.
still have not seen life come out of a butt-gina. I've never
Right. Right.
seen two homosexuals. Spit babies can't live. You still
Right.
have to have the male female dichotomy, but we have what is it now, brother? 72 different quote unquote genders? No, there's two sexes. You're not going to make a
Right.
baby other
Right.
than that.
Right. Right. Oh yeah, for sure. That reminds me of one of my favorite National Lampoon cartoons, but I won't go there. It's another planet where there are 26 genders, and two of them meet in a bar, and they decide they want to have sex. So they go from bar to bar because they got to get 26 people involved before they can actually have sex. So suddenly it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and they've been at every conceivable bar, and they have 25 genders. They're still missing ones. They says, "We've been working all night. We still can't find a gamma. Can't we just use two deltas instead of a gamma?" Everybody looks at them and points their finger and yells, "Pervert!" Anyway, so yeah, it's kind of the multiple genders thing is not going to
Wow,
work.
you just brought up Logan's Run. Remember the 70
Yeah,
dystopia? Look,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Planet
yeah.
of the Apes, Logan's Run, all these movies that were so dystopian back in the
Right.
Omega Man. Think about this. This is not new.
Right.
Everybody who's going through this, honestly, I'm gonna go on a diatribe for about 2 minutes.
Uh-huh.
Folks, you young millennials, you young Gen Zs, listen to me on this, and he will fill you in on any deficits I give you. But I guarantee you, Robert understands what I'm talking about. This was social programming. The only person I've found that has been able on his YouTube to get success is Jay Dyer.
Hmm.
And honestly, in the boiler room, he gets in there. They delve deep in it. Robert, I guarantee, delves deep in it. But we all have to comply to a certain point if we want to be viable. And with
Hmm.
that,
Yeah.
brother, I'm sending it right back to you.
Well, Dyer stuff is really interesting, especially his stuff about Stanley Kubrick is the fast is that that's probably his best known area because there was a series of those. And that's pretty fascinating stuff. And it's again, this brings you, a lot of this stuff, just for example, it's the same thing as the modern, we see this binge of zombies that came out like within the last decade. Suddenly zombies were everywhere and vampires, and they're all meant to, there's an argument that those all symbolize some part of our collective psyche. It's a kind of an idealized or not idealized, a graphic representation of some part of our that we don't want to deal
Dehumanize.
with. Yeah. And those are all subconscious fears that are being expressed through these fictional creatures somehow. It's subconscious. And I think that's true to a certain extent. I also agree with you that some of it is quite intentional. And if you look at these dystopians that are now realities, look at Orwell's 1984 is now seems conservative by what we can do in terms of the police state. I think to a certain extent, it's consciously. I mean, look, man, I won't go. No, never mind. I won't go where I was about to go to another example. I definitely won't go there. But a lot of these things are subconscious and conscious at the same time, which brings me to the question of whose consciousness are we really talking about? And is it a human consciousness or is it something larger? That's my point of all that. But so I think what we're seeing is overall in this new century, which really is only becoming, it's been a child for the first 18 years, and now it's coming of age, coincidentally. Not that I claim that it has a normal human lifespan, but we're seeing the kind of entities who humans are is changing. And it does change throughout history. You know, the paradigm of what a human being is was very different in the 20th century than it was in the 5th century. We're seeing our concept of groups and nations change. We're seeing, you know, I always thought, for example, you know, there's this weird thing in the law. There's this whole history of case law about whether a corporation is a person, which I always found kind of an interesting red herring. And of course they're not, you know, but you have this free speech is applied to corporations thing, which has changed the way the modern course of legal expression with regard to things like, you know, political spending, for example.
Which was pushed by Republicans, by the way.
Yeah.
See,
yeah,
nobody wants, they don't want to look at that false left-right paradigm, but okay,
right.
brother, go on.
Yeah. You know, it's the question also being the follow-up question to that being, to what extent are these things kind of like people, and that they do have their own intelligence sometimes? They're not just it's not just a corporation. You know, when these things were formed in the Middle Ages, was like a group of a few people who just want legal immunity, don't want personal immunity for the consequences of their actions in the merchant system, right? I mean, basically, it was a kind of false person that was constructed. That's not what these modern super companies are at all. It's nothing like that. They are, in fact, behaving as kind of more than human entities out there. And they're using AI to do that. And they're becoming less and less human, but less and less human is becoming the person of the 21st century, just as we as individuals are becoming less human.
And yet they've allowed it to go into the Admiralty Court. I mean, we can go into we can go into rabbit holes tonight. This is your rabbit hole night. But I will tell you, as a former military policeman enforcing the UCMJ and the USC, and as a federal cop, with the state law that we were allowed to assimilate, and there was a book in the UCMJ and also the USC. Here's the interesting thing. When I see those courts of admiralty, I know what that means. But it doesn't matter, because once they get you hemmed and gemmed up into it, you're there. And it's the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And if you disbelieve me, get involved in a criminal process. You'll find out very quickly. It's not about justice. It's about bankrupting or destroying your life.
Well, I mean, that became very explicit in the criminal justice system with the federal system that came into place under the mandatory minimums. I had a good friend who was a lifelong public defender, which means his politics and mine were pretty drastically different. We were good friends for a long time. And, you know, he was a state public defender and had gotten to the top of his game in the state he was in. You know, was down there on the Mexican border doing it was all cocaine and murders. And if you're the top lawyer in your public defender office down there, you're doing cocaine and murder defense. And so he got burned out on that. So he left the state system and went into the federal system, thinking it would relax him, and went from a southern state to a northern state and was looking at the Canadian border. And then you suddenly realize you have now different drugs. You have heroin instead of cocaine, and you still have lots of killings. But the point being that suddenly going from the state system, which still is pretty much a vestige, even though it's been tampered with standard legal system, the federal system is now just a matter of being able to prove you're innocent is not even part of the equation. The first thing the public defender goes to, it just goes through and interviews people, putting people on the grid under the guidelines. It's very Soviet style. You know, it's almost has nothing. It's a travesty. It's a parody of itself. There is no criminal justice system anymore, except in the whole court system now. And I don't deal with the criminal justice system. I deal with at an arm's length with the civil court system all the time. Is just really a show. I mean, I'm finding that judges, I'm thinking, why did I bother learning what the laws are and how they work when I see judges disobeying them flagrantly at every turn? And they do that because they're elected judges, and the democratic population that put them in place wouldn't tolerate their adherence to the laws that they're sworn to uphold. I don't know. That's totally a divergence, but the whole system. You're right. It's not. If you think we're living under rule of law, you're just wrong. It's been a long. If that was ever the course in America, that was a long time ago. If you can afford them, you can fight a good show battle. But that's the reason I think all these legal proceedings that we're seeing in the congressional proceedings are such a joke. They'll do what they want, and that's the reason. I guess my bottom line on most of the things that I'm saying these days is that if we're allowing ourselves to argue among lines of legalities or rights or really ideologies of any kind, we're kind of being misled by the trappings and the names and the titles with the weapons of an older era. And I think the thing to do is to find one of these things, cling on to it. Ride the tiger until you can jump off and find a different tiger, until different animals form out there.
Exactly. That is why, you know what I'm about to say. Ride the tiger. Nicholas, I'll let you finish the last name.
Well, it was Julius Evola.
Julius Evola. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, we'll get into that here in a second, but yeah, Julius Evola, Ride the Tiger, baby. Excuse me. And we can also see Greg Johnson's Countercurrents.
Right.
Being, it's virtual book burning.
Right.
We're seeing Countercurrents having that. We're seeing all kinds of, like I tell everybody, look at everything from the right to the left, the false right and to the right. It's a circle. And come to your own decision. But, of course, critical thinking, that's the first casualty in this war. And your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing to do, I think, is to not allow that's one reason I haven't been, the stuff I was writing, everything I've written, I've left up on the internet. And it's interesting to see what people are actually reading, because I can look at the page hits. I don't disagree with any of it. I'm kind of done with most of it because I'm kind of dealt with everything. I feel like I filled in all the squares in that box that I really felt like addressing. And I don't really have anything else to say about those issues. If you're talking about all these right-left political, moral, and legal issues that are being used to address the problems, which I think are just leftover 20th century problems that have ridden us this far into the 21st, I think the concept of the self needs to be different. I think that probably I get more out of I'm not an artist. I wish I was, because I love art. I play bad music and can't draw, but I do both. And I think art in writing fiction, maybe, I think art is the way to go in terms of thinking around the corners of the dualistic thinking of the structures that we have. I think you can insinuate things with good art that can't be stated otherwise. And not so much in the form of art. I'm going to suggest everybody go out and paint, but try to find aesthetic reasons to pursue things. And by doing this, you can, to some extent, eschew the formal categories that you're normally forced to think in, if that makes any sense. Music works for that, to me, for some extent. So, anyway, I assume you're there. Hello. Uh-oh. Just a minute here. I seem to have silence here. Hello. Anybody there? Kaiser Chef, are you there? Perhaps we should terminate this and see if it reconnects on my end.
Okay, have no idea what happened. I'm going to try to make contact with him again. Give me a second. Have no idea what just happened. So, here we go. And sorry. Somehow you dropped. So what was the last thing? I was listening to you, and then all of a sudden you dropped.
Yeah, I sort of got to a point and paused, and I thought, I don't hear anything. So
yeah,
I have no idea where you lost me, where we lost each other there.
I don't either, brother. So my point was, while I was listening, you were bringing up some good points with like countercurrents and stuff like that we were talking about earlier. The last bits I wanted to cover with you was basically what you saw with the destruction of statues, but I mean this in a deeper level.
Right.
I'm glad that I was able to bring you back on this. My wife was like, I don't know why, but I just saw it go away, and I was like, whoa, I wasn't even looking.
Yeah. Right.
You were talking about Andersonville.
Yeah.
Or earlier, before this stream started.
Right.
And then I brought up the old Ohio State prison. And that was the way I wanted to end it. And it's pretty cool that I guess you guys see all the warts and everything going on. So that's what happened. I have no idea how I lost you, man.
Okay, that's all right. Talking the statues. Okay, I'll be glad to jump to that because it's kind of done. I have no idea where we lost audio, but I'll come back to it some other time. I'm a Southerner, so to me, what they're doing is, it's all about erasing history. You see the same thing. It's the obvious. If you tell me, it's almost that they're doing it in such a way that it's a parable of it's a parable. I don't know. It's a mockery of itself. What they're doing. It's so obvious. I drive by a statue, not every day, but occasionally. There's this statue in Tennessee of Nathan Bedford Forrest that I drive by occasionally. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's on private land, so they can't really do anything about it. It's a really ugly statue. It's a horrible statue. Whoever the artist was that did this thing, I'm sure I'm pissing somebody off, but it's really not very good in the first place. It's kind of a I don't know. It's hard to choose this as something to defend as an example of high art because he looks like Nathan Bedford Forrest just ate something that really something really hot or something. I don't know. But I have no idea what the facial expression is on this thing. But it's him on his horse, right? And by the way, he's kind of a hero of mine, actually, in terms of military heroes. But if you see his later history, you'll see that what he's made out to be is interesting. He was also bent and forced to conform in his old age to the new governments that he had to interact with. But because of something that may or may not have happened at the end of the war. But this thing was recently defaced and somebody covered it with pink paint, which just strikes me as bizarre. What is that? What's the statement there?
Well, the statement is the same thing as they brought up bones from people and exhumed without state saying you can exhume those
in
bones.
Memphis,
yeah,
in Memphis.
You know where I'm talking about.
And
what's the old adage that classical liberals, and I'm sure you were a classical liberal at one time, just like I was.
Sure.
Those that fail to remember history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, it's
So,
Mencken, H.L. Mencken.
yeah, H.L. Mencken. So, if you're not doing that, what have you just done? You're trying
Right.
to destroy history
Well, what's
and
being done
change
in
it.
these particular? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. My last words was and change it.
Yeah,
I mean that,
yeah.
brother.
Well, they're you have to erase it to change it because what they're making. I mean, I don't want to get started in the last few minutes of our discussion on the Civil War because I think that the the losing side in the Civil War, like the losing side of World War II, were probably one of the two last great stands of traditional society against the onrushing Yahweh forces. Even though Confederate
I
America was
agree.
explicitly very Christian, but just in terms of a noble older society against a kind of a modern disease society. But and again, as a Southerner, so I have a Confederate ancestor whose grave I visit every few months, mostly because it's in the cemetery with some other ancestors. But anyway, but it's it is a horrible thing simply because the Civil War is actually an easy illustration. If you study the history of the Civil War, you realize what it was really about as opposed to the way it's being taught historically. That's an easy set of historical lies to penetrate. Much easier than World War II, by the way. It's an
Well,
easier red pill if you're open to it.
if you know this, I'm an Ohioan, and
Mhm,
where I'm from, when I grew up, not when I was young, but when I was born in this area,
mhm,
but I grew up in Cleveland Heights,
mhm,
which was a mostly Jewish area.
mhm,
And then I came back to the Columbus area later on. And the interesting part to me, there was a place, you can look at it. All you guys, vet me, Camp Sherman.
mhm.
And that camp was built as a memorial. And I have issues with this on several levels. I'm going to go into each level real quick, and I want to hear your rebuttal or your thoughts on it. Either way, we're good. We'll always be good on this. Here's the thing. There was something called, and it was the first special forces in the world, Morgan's Raiders. They wreaked havoc in the North. And yet they got captured in Ohio. They went to the old Ohio State Pen. We talked about this before this show started. And they put them in there, and most of them died from typhus and different diseases. But nobody wants to talk about it. As a matter of fact, they pulled that prison down. I'm not going to get into the backstory on everything that went on. But the people that died from there were Morgan's Raiders. And so they made that place for them to rest for their lives. It's in the middle of Columbus. That area happens to be, quote unquote, a black area, right?
Mhm.
Well, they destroyed the statue. They beheaded the statue, which is sick. And when you fail to remember or you fail to respect, and this, now I have to shift. In Iraq, when I went back in 2005, I met a dude that in an artillery barrage killed a brother of mine during the first Gulf War. I know who it was and what happened, whatever. And this guy was honest with me. And we talked. And guess what? I had no hatred for him. We distrusted each other when we first met. But I would trust him with my life and the life of my wife and my son now because he earned it. And that is the thing. You don't despise the people you may hurt their feelings, but that's the problem I see in America is they don't have that disconnect. As a veteran speaking,
Mhm.
Love to hear your opinion, brother.
Well, I mean, there's that whole thing about, if you read the old Norse stories or Germanic stories when they talk about the enemy, or even, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, when you're talking about, on the plains, they're very, they pump themselves up by talking about the might and righteousness to some extent of their adversaries. They honor their adversaries to honor their own victories. The modern tendency tends to say, "Oh, they were scum, and we annihilated them." So what's the honor? What's the victory in annihilating scum and stomping on cockroaches? It says nothing about the true nature of your enemy or your vanquished enemy. It says something about you when you do that. When I grew up in the South, I mean,
I agree.
no one in the North was saying horrible things about the Confederacy. They respected it as a defeated enemy that could be brought back in. I mean, and nothing worse than the situation after I'm losing the word now. The Reformation, not the Reformation, but the bringing back in of the South into the Union was done horribly, but after a while, it did sort of heal and it did sort of work, even though long time damage was done. And by the time I was a child, it was respectful on all sides, and that's no
Well,
longer the case. And so, why would somebody bring back a breach? Why would somebody reopen a wound that was healed? You have to ask yourself that. Who's getting something out of that? Whose advantage does that serve?
well, it's the people who want to destroy a nation. And
Mm-hmm.
that's my common conclusion. If you don't agree with me, we're not going to have any issues. But it's about if you can't have that basic knowledge of disagreement, guess what?
Yeah,
There's something
yeah,
wrong
yeah.
with you, not with
Right,
me, and not with you. And when I said you, it didn't mean you. I
right,
meant
right,
the people that the SJWs, the bullshit people that
right.
honestly they've done nothing. They just I've got to feel so superior to you, and I can't do anything unless I know I'm social signaling against you. No, there's black men. I remember seeing a video a long time ago of a black guy who fought in the Confederacy, and he carried proudly that flag and wore his
Oh
old
yeah.
uniform. And you know what? Everybody that doesn't understand the truth will never get it. They'll just say, ah, he's trying to be this, that, and the other. No, there's something called heart of a soldier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, I think as you're talking about, you respect your enemy on the battlefield. If you don't, but that's part of it too. If you don't respect your adversary, I won't even say enemy to that extent. But you obviously have an opponent. If you don't respect your opponent, you have to try to kill him, I guess. And I'm talking outside my own experience, but I mean, you can't have any respect for yourself or for your own activity. I think that's part of it, and I think part of it is just the overall. As long as they turn all against all, as long as they have us all fighting each other, they can control everything. And they is not any particular. It's not. Don't imagine five guys that look in any particular way. They is not like that anymore. But as long as they can keep us fighting each other, they don't. There's no opposition. That's the whole. That's what's going on, I think. So.
Well, I'll tell you this: they're not going to have me fighting against Ghost,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
and they won't have you fighting against Ghost. Look, the past is behind. The future is forward. I have a son. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
you have children. It's not my business, and I'm not asking. But the truth is, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to build better men and better women. That's the point.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is about mentoring. It's about giving truth. And if they want to pull my stream down on this one, like they did with James Fetzer, I don't give a fuck. And I mean that. That's the first time you've heard this word.
Okay.
And, but I always enjoy our conversations because I hope to have a conversation with Colonel X. He's on my page. You can all go look up that video. And I will definitely link you to it and have you two have a conversation. And I will be out of that conversation completely. Because it's two meetings of beautiful minds. And there has to be a time. And also I have to say this. You will be on... What's the date you're going to be on WPRPN? I will not be on there specifically because I want you to...
Unfortunately, I can't tell you right now.
Okay. He'll be
I don't know. I have to look, be reminded of that.
He'll be on World Pirate Radio Podcast Network that I'm on a lot of times.
Later this month, but anyway.
Yeah. But please listen to it. Go to his podcast, link in the description. Anything else you want to put out?
No, I think it's a good place to leave this one for now. That's exhausts my mental ability at the moment. So.
Oh, okay, brother. Anyways, I'm super happy you came on my podcast once again.
Well, thanks for hosting me again. Thank you.
Hey,
hopefully you can. Yeah.
You're a hell fellow Matt, and that's the way we'll leave this. And with that being said, I'll talk to you offline for a second.
Okay.
I'm going to exit out with my final song that I always use, Inside Enemy Headquarters. And here we go.
Now this time I can hear the music. Hello. Hello.